So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this exciting panel that we will be reflecting on Benedict XVI and the most key topics, conscience and truth, truth and freedom, the renewal within the hermeneutic of continuity, and Charles Pegues' depiction of hope and its connection with Ratzinger's theology of hope. So we have here three excellent panelists and speakers. I think precisely because you have the connection to their CVs, I'm not gonna, take their time. I think it's precious that they can talk to you. So we have space for conversation afterwards. So if you want to Google them or just click into the panel, you will find the CV. So we go straight to the first panelist today. So we have here Madeleine Wennerstrom, independent scholar, political philosopher, and yeah.
Okay, thank you. The title of my paper is From Synderesis to Anamnesis, Ratzinger's Personalized Conscience. In his essay, Conscience and Truth, Joseph Ratzinger notes that two notions of the Catholic conscience are set in opposition to each other. One he calls a renewed understanding, and the other a superseded preconciliar model. In the remainder of the essay, Ratzinger puts forth yet a third notion of conscience. And here, according to Vincent Twomey, we find Ratzinger's most important contribution to moral theology. But in spite of Twomey's assertion of its importance, Ratzinger's account of conscience is comparatively little talked about and perhaps not fully understood. Recently, Matthew Levering and Reinhard Hutter have written excellent books dealing with the Catholic conception of conscience, and both mention Ratzinger, but only briefly. So why does Ratzinger not merit more attention? So in all fairness to those authors, Hutter's writing a book on Newman, not Benedict XVI, and Levering is surveying an entire century of moral theology. So this paper is really not a critique of them. If anything, their shorter treatments are an invitation to more reflection on this topic in Ratzinger. But some might find it curious, however, that while they are not very critical of him, neither author praises Ratzinger's conscience as unreservedly as Twomey. And so I would like to discuss why some might hesitate to sign on fully to Ratzinger's conscience, and then proceed to make the argument that what the changes Ratzinger appears to make to the traditional view of conscience are really adjustments in service of what he calls the anthropology of conscience, which turns out to be nothing other than the Christian account of the human person. And I won't be able to give a full treatment of Ratzinger's conscience in this paper, because it's very multifaceted, but with my time, I'm going to focus on this personal anthropological dimension of conscience, which I believe is somewhat overlooked in spite of being of special significance to Ratzinger. So both Hutter and Levering gesture toward two potential problems with Ratzinger's conscience, or 2 points where he seems to depart from the tradition's way of talking about it. First, Ratzinger appears to go against doctors of the church and medieval texts, dispensing with the theological vocabulary of synderesis in favor of Platonic anamnesis. And Hutter and Levering both remain unpersuaded by Ratzinger's proposal here to swap the Greek terms, for fear that departing from Thomistic distinctions between actus and habitus might open the way to misunderstandings, they say, about the nature of an erring conscience, among other things. Now, the second possible issue with Ratzinger's conscience is that on a certain reading, Ratzinger appears to focus conscience too much on the subject or the self. And such a focus generally, Levering writes, can give too expansive a place to conscience in the Christian moral life, and lead to what he calls conscience-centered morality, which bestows upon the individual the task of deliberating upon church teachings and determining whether or not they should be obeyed. According to Levering, conscience-centered morality is enabled in part by moral theologians' adoption of existentialist and personalist philosophical understandings of authenticity. And Hutter concurs that anthropocentric ethics cuts against scripture and tradition's theocentric and teleological ethics. Now, Ratzinger, of course, disavows conscience-centered morality and any idea of conscience as merely the justification for subjectivity, in his own words. And Levering duly notes this. Yet Ratzinger does give credence to the idea that at some level, the goal of conscience is self-knowledge and authenticity. Conscience, he recognizes, is deeply tied to anthropology and bound up with one's personal identity. And he leans into the characterization of conscience as the core of one's being, where one encounters one's true self. Ratzinger writes, "The question of conscience leads, in fact, to the question of man's existence itself." And he states that conscience ought to mean man's openness to the ground of his being, the power of perception for what is highest and most essential. I want to be clear that neither Levering nor Hütter criticize Ratzinger on this point specifically, and Levering simply places him in the category of post-conciliar German theologians in his book, many of whom integrated existential elements and philosophical personalism in their own accounts of conscience. And these other more progressive German theologians seem to share Ratzinger's interest in what I have called personalizing conscience. So take Cardinal Joseph Fuchs, who similarly describes conscience as the inner core of the person, in which the person is totally present to himself. Now, Fuchs's account is suspect. It leads quickly to subjectivism, relativism, and rejection of church teachings. So how does Benedict, who's famous for denouncing in no uncertain terms what he himself called the dictatorship of relativism, rescue his own account of conscience from this same critique? How does his turn to the subject turn back to God and retain the understanding of him as truly other? Levering rightly sees that many accounts of conscience that are focused inward on the person, like Fuchs's, do not escape solipsism. But he acknowledges that Benedict's conscience, quote, recalls us to our creaturehood under God. And this engenders the humility necessary to acknowledge God as prior and to admit our dependence on him and the bindingness of his law. In holding that God is prior, Ratzinger understands man to be an entirely different sort of being from the self or the unique I that absorbs Fuchs. Fuchs works with a modern notion of man as a super individual that exists most purely as an I before relating to anyone else. The point of uniting with God for Fuchs is to gain self-knowledge, which is purer for those who believe in God, he says, and the importance of the Christ event. Now, Ratzinger would agree that all knowledge, especially self-knowledge, is purified by belief in God and that all things find their perfection in him. But he's uninterested at this point in man as a unique I, an individual tasked with his own actualization. Instead, Ratzinger addresses both modern man and God-made man, Jesus Christ, as persons, and emphasizes the relationship between them as prior to any human identity. At its most basic level, or its ontological level, human conscience for Ratzinger is the recollection, or anamnesis, of the relationship that exists between the human person and God. Understanding this element of Ratzinger's account of conscience requires better understanding his conception of personhood and relationship, which is contained in a 1973 lecture, later reprinted in translation in Communio, concerning the notion of person in theology. But before branching out into that work, let's return to Ratzinger's Conscience and Truth, which we mentioned at the outset. There, Ratzinger is responding to these two accounts of conscience he finds in the modern church. One preconciliar, supposedly outdated, almost tyrannical model that binds the human conscience to a strict set of rules, and then one so-called renewed understanding that respects the freedom of conscience, but sometimes goes so far as to consider the judgment of an individual's conscience infallible, even when it is at variance with the magisterium. A morality of authority on the one hand, and a morality of conscience on the other, are two opposing models locked in a struggle with each other, Ratzinger writes. Yet he holds that a free conscience and a conscience bound by authority only appear opposed when one overlooks something deeper, he writes, which gives freedom and human existence its meaning. Now, for Ratzinger, it is the assumption of a false anthropology that overlooks this something deeper in man, and ultimately pits freedom and authority and man and the church against one another. To reconcile all of this, Ratzinger turns the discussion, which he notes typically centers on the modern concepts of autonomy, heteronomy, self-determination, and external authority, to consideration of more ancient terminology, in order to uncover a truer view of the human person. He does not opt for medieval or neo-scholastic proofs, but for Greek philosophical language, the language of anamnesis and the language of the person. In the medieval tradition, conscience was treated as having two levels, synderesis and conscientia. Synderesis, St. Thomas designated a natural habit or God-given implanted knowledge of the first principles of practical reason and morality. The subsequent act of conscientia is what we often call conscience, associated with prudence, wherein one determines what to do in a given situation by applying knowledge to actions. Ratzinger believes that the medieval tradition is right in according two levels to conscience. He believes more careful attention, however, is due to synderesis, which he calls the essential aspect of the whole question of conscience, that has unfortunately remained unclear in its exact meaning. According to him, the unhelpful term synderesis should be replaced with anamnesis. Anamnesis, he says, is philosophically deeper and purer, but anamnesis, above all, also harmonizes with key motifs of biblical thought, and I personally want to emphasize the anthropology derived from it. Anamnesis makes clear the fact that something like an original memory of the good and true has been implanted in us, that there is an inner ontological tendency within man who is created in the likeness of God toward the divine, writes Ratzinger. This anamnesis of the origin, which Ratzinger also calls anamnesis of the creator, is identical to the ground of our existence. He says it is a capacity to recall not only our original orientation toward the good, but our fundamental orientation toward and relationship with God, who is goodness itself. Man has this original relationship stamped upon his memory. He is called to communion with God. If he is not turned in on himself, Ratzinger says, he hears this echo from within. He sees, that's it. That is what my nature points to and seeks. Ratzinger can be criticized for dwelling on this first level of conscience and not treating the second level, conscientia, with equal weight. And to be sure, he does not give a complete account of conscience here that would satisfy your average Thomist, and it doesn't wholly satisfy Lovering or Hooter. Yet the purpose of Ratzinger's meditation here, I think, is not only to correct progressive moral theologians, but to explore and explain the anthropological dimension of conscience in a philosophical but also pastoral manner. And the shift to anamnesis serves this need. It makes room for his account of the person. Ratzinger's choice to focus on anamnesis is indeed a choice to remain focused on the subject in a certain sense. But here the human subject is not an individual or superego. In Ratzinger's account, the dignity of a human person does not consist in his autonomy, but in his relationship to God, his creator. Only when a man encounters God as wholly other and recognizes his own dependence upon him in all things does he understand himself properly as a human person. Authentic human conscience facilitates this encounter, the result of which is not self-aggrandizement or self-obsession, but humility and other-directedness, which Ratzinger says must translate into a willingness to suffer and a sense of mission. In conscience, Ratzinger says, my own I is the site of the profoundest surpassing of self and contact with him from whom I came and toward whom I am going. Conscience, then, reveals the fundamental reality of relationship and its defining power over us. For Ratzinger, this is what it means to recognize oneself and others as persons. Ratzinger explains that the Trinitarian God is the very source of our notion of personhood, and Christ is the exemplar for human persons. This is what Ratzinger argues in his Communio article concerning the notion of the person, which I believe helps elucidate this anthropology of conscience, because it helps us to understand just what it is that anamnesis is recalling. In this article, Ratzinger makes the surprising claim that Boethius has an entirely insufficient understanding of the person, which has prevailed in Western philosophy. The individual substance of a rational nature does not go far enough. In short, a human being is not only a rational animal, we must add to this understanding that we are relational. Ratzinger writes, in God, person means relation. Relation, being related, is not something superadded to the person, but it is the person itself. In its nature, the person exists only as relation. The Trinity is what provides, he says, the decisive illumination of what person must mean, not a substance that closes itself, but the phenomenon of complete relativity, which is of course realized in its entirety only in the one who is God, which indicates the direction of all personal being. From here, he continues, there is a transition from the doctrine of God into Christology and then into anthropology. In the West, Ratzinger writes, it was in light of this knowledge of God that the true nature of humanity became clear in a new way. Our memory of God, or anamnesis, sheds light upon and brings into relief our human nature, revealing our imperfection and our dignity simultaneously. This brings about humility and obedience, which Levering rightly recognizes as an outgrowth of Ratzinger's conscience. But the anamnesis that informs conscience is not just an individual anamnesis of one's own creatureliness. It is also a shared anamnesis with the whole people of God, or the anamnesis of the new we, Ratzinger says, which is granted to us in the incorporation into Christ and his church. The sureness of Christian memory points us to the mystery of the incarnation and Christ as the model of human perfection. Ratzinger marvels at how Christ's being a person of God does not entail that he is not a human person. To the contrary, he is the picture of human personhood par excellence. True conscience reminds us of who we are as human persons and measures us against the true man, Jesus Christ, who is in perfect relationship with the Father and who is the very picture of obedience. It commands, but it does not guarantee obedience. In both the medieval account and Ratzinger's, conscience can err at the second level, conscientia, that of applying knowledge to circumstances. For Ratzinger, this is because human memory, even at the level of anamnesis, is compromised by concupiscence and fractured by sin, just as our access to the knowledge of first principles imparted by Thomas's synderesis can be inhibited by habitual sin. This is why, as fallen beings, we need the church, whose memory is sure. Anamnesis reminds us, even in the depths of conscience, that we do not stand alone as individuals, but as persons in relationship to other persons, the divine persons of the Trinity and the human persons that make up the church. Ratzinger's anamnesis is not only accommodating of biblical anthropology and Christology, but also of the role of the church in conscience. And now to close. Ratzinger, like his more progressive contemporaries, holds that a valid account of conscience must contain a robust account of the human person, and that the language used to describe conscience needs some updating. But he does not naively adopt existentialist and personalist language that undercuts the traditional understanding of man or the church's role in conscience. Rather, the account of personhood Ratzinger relies upon is a deeply Christian one, inextricably tied up with Christology and ecclesiology. Responsibly promoting, then, the personal dimension of conscience, Ratzinger shows, need not lead to subjectivism. The church already provides a personalized conception of conscience that resonates with the longings of modern man and Christian memory. Ratzinger needs only to remind us. Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful account. And now from St. Louis to South Bend, to one of the fellows of the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture as doctoral student on theology. And for an account on Pegu's depiction of hope and its relationship with Ratzinger's account on hope. Thank you, Maura.
Thank you. Today, I'd like to propose that in his poem, The Portal of the Mystery of Hope, Charles Péguy recovers the second theological virtue from its relative neglect in the tradition in comparison to faith and charity, and offers new resources with which to articulate a more robust understanding of eschatology and the Paschal mystery. Peguy's poem implies that charity is the primary virtue expressed on Good Friday, and faith the virtue of Easter Sunday, and between them, hope is the virtue evoked by Holy Saturday. Further, I show how Peguy's depiction of hope resonates powerfully with and inspires the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, for whom the virtue of hope and the theology of Holy Saturday were also deeply significant and intertwined. As we draw toward the end of this Jubilee year of hope, I contend that, like Joseph Ratzinger, we can be enriched by Peguy's profound poetic theology as we consider the last things. Peguy's poem, first published in 1911, seeks to impart the culture and experience of France, Christianity's first daughter on the threshold of the First World War. It is the second in a trilogy of book-length poems connected to Joan of Arc, though in this one, that connection is somewhat muted. The speaker, Madame Gervais, is addressing a young Joan, but does so by taking on the voice and persona of God the Father, and Joan herself never speaks in this poem. Peguy proposes his poetry as a dialogue partner for theology by repeatedly drawing our attention to the imaginative and literary character of Christ's own teaching in Scripture, especially in his parables. A man had 2 sons, the poem reminds us over and over. A shepherd leaves his 99 sheep in search of the one. And yet the poem insists Christ did not come to live the life of a human being for 33 years, to suffer and to enter the silent tomb and to rise again, quote, just to spin yarns. Rather, Christ's words, enfleshed in stories and parables, and thus in an earthly literary register, are eternal words. Astonishingly, those divine words are bequeathed to us and to our own fragile ears and mouths and hands to pass on to others. And this is quote 1 on the handout that just went out. O misery, O misfortune, that this would happen to us, that it would belong to us, that it would depend on us to make the word understood through centuries of centuries, to make it resound. This exclamation, I believe, is Peguy's own articulation of his poetic task. His poem succeeds or fails on this very basis, whether or not it allows the word of Christ to resound. Peguy's rootedness and devotion to the word, especially as expressed in Scripture, is, I believe, what draws the special admiration of Joseph Ratzinger. Admittedly, Ratzinger does not cite Peguy extensively in the manner that his friend Hans Urs Balthasar does. It's possible that the strong influence of Peguy that I detect in him is through or by way of Balthasar. Still, there's a clear and tantalizing explicit reference to Peguy in Ratzinger's work, Eschatology, Death and Eternal Life. It arises in a section on the last things, where Ratzinger reflects on the meaning of the saints judging the world, as it says in 1 Corinthians. He construes this judgment fascinatingly as their intercession for humanity before God. This is quote 2. This intercession is the only truly fundamental element in the saints judging. Through their exercising of such judgment, they belong, as people who both pray and save, to the doctrine of purgatory and to the Christian practice which goes with it. As Charles Peguy so beautifully put it, I hope in you for me. It is when the I is at stake that the you is called upon in the form of hope. Though this is the only place where Peguy is explicitly cited in the text, the portal's unique theology of hope surfaces at a key juncture, and I would argue, echoes in key moments throughout the rest of Ratzinger's work. Hope, Ratzinger will insist, is not solitary. Hope is not merely between the individual me and God. Rather, it is profoundly communal. It exists in and among a web of relationships. I hope in you for me. The saints themselves in their seat of judgment nonetheless hope for us as we hope in them. This powerful motif reverberates again later in a slightly different register in the Pope's encyclical Spe Salvi. The reference to Peguy in Ratzinger's text surfaces again in the Pope's profound exploration of the role the saints play in joining Christ in his descent into the realm of death as the ground of our hope, to which I will return later. But first, I turn to the tradition preceding Peguy. Aquinas teaches that hope is a theological virtue for the wayfarer, but just as faith gives way to sight, hope gives way to possession and beatitude. The object of hope for Thomas is a future good that is difficult but possible to attain, and as such, it has for its twofold object union with God in heaven and the divine assistance which makes the attainment of that good possible. Peguy, it seems, would wholeheartedly agree that hope is the virtue of the wayfarer on the arduous way to God. His agreement offers itself in the shape of this wandering poem, The Portal, that mirrors that very journey by moving forward and doubling back on itself, imitating the progress of human life through its various anxieties and trials, its repetitive rhythms and meandering digressions. This pattern, as Jennifer Newsom Martin insightfully observes, is fugal. The poem, she says, presses forward always. The repetitions are never exact, but are rather deeply iterative. Reading Peguy means rereading Peguy, even your first time through it. Indeed, the poem characterizes the character of Hope herself as a wayfarer, a little girl walking along between her older sisters, Faith and Charity, running ahead of them but always doubling back, as if beckoning, traveling the same ground and again in childlike delight. Peguy's poem performs its very repetitions in the pattern of human life with its seasons and cycles, and evokes in its very structure the experience of being on the way. It is important to notice as well that Peggy carefully acknowledges the traditional Thomistic teaching on hope. In the beginning of the poem, a catechetical dialogue occurs between a priest and a little child, which you can see in quote 3, although I won't read it aloud. It is as if aware that his poem's overall characterization of hope will be suggesting something very new, unexpected, even daring. Peggy seeks to head off criticism at the outset by affirming the traditional teaching on hope. He thus implies that all he will say about hope flows from the church. And yet the formal tone of the priest, the child's dutifully memorized repetition of the answers, renders the scene itself playful and ever so slightly ironic. The child's given definition of hope is immediately qualified, a sentence later, by the poem's startling observation that, of all the virtues and of the 3 theological virtues, hope is perhaps the most pleasing to God. Such a claim, of course, would not be found in any catechism. I want to suggest that Peggy is doing a rescue and recovery mission of hope from its relative neglect and, in his view, widespread misunderstanding. 2 problems regarding modern reception of hope are also identified by Ratzinger as Pope in his encyclical Spe Salvi. He admits that the primary object of hope, eternal life with God in heaven, is incomprehensible, uncompelling, and perhaps even distasteful to many people in the modern world. This is quote 4. The question arises, do we really want this, to live eternally? Perhaps many people reject the faith today simply because they do not find the prospect of eternal life attractive. What they desire is not eternal life at all, but this present life, for which faith in eternal life seems something of an impediment. To continue living forever, endlessly, appears more like a curse than a gift. The inability of many Christians to imagine heaven and the reticence to describe it among theologians and preachers is a serious obstacle to hope. Further, Scripture itself seems to place strong limitations on what can be envisioned in terms of hope. For in hope we were saved, Paul says. Now hope that sees for itself is not hope, for who hopes for what one sees? The second difficulty the Pope identifies is that Christian hope can seem self-centered. Benedict observes that this virtue, quote, has been subjected to an increasingly harsh critique in the modern times. It's dismissed as pure individualism, a way of abandoning the world to its misery and taking refuge in the private form of eternal salvation. One can hear in the background Marx's devastating characterization of Christianity as the opiate of the people. Peggy, too, is sensitive to these problems. To the first, the impossibility of envisioning the object of hope, he responds with a deeply image-laden text that, in Jennifer Newsom Martin's words, is unabashedly incarnational and feeds the imagination with an incessant series of vivid images, quote, wheat, wine, water, oil, hands, blood, feet, wombs, breast milk, food, nourishment, time. All of these appear over and over again. Peggy takes hope from the abstract realm of what is not seen to what is seen every single day by the poor and the rich, the lowly and the elite, the believer and the unbeliever. Since hope is the visually neglected virtue, the one that seems to preclude sight of any kind by no less an authority than St. Paul himself, Peggy's poem responds to that apathetic character of hope with an endless cascade of pictures, many of them scriptural, which enflesh hope for us. Peggy's cataphasis, if you will, underlines hope's mystery by way of excess. To the second difficulty, the seemingly individualistic private nature of hope, I draw your attention to Michel Boris's keen observation correlating both Ratzinger and Peggy's horizontal and communal notions of hope in quote 5. The Pope reminds us, to live for Christ means allowing oneself to be drawn into his being for others. It means recognizing that just as my life and lives of my brethren continually spill over into one another for good and for ill, the salvation of my brethren is somehow my salvation. Their hope is my hope. Hope, in a Christian sense, is always hope for others as well. Or, in the words of the poet Charles Peggy, you do not save your souls you would a treasure. You save it as you lose a treasure in surrendering it. We must save ourselves together. We must arrive together before the good Lord. What would he say if we arrived before him, came home to him without the others? As we will see, Peggy pointedly ends his poem on hope by reflecting on the burial of Christ in the beginning of Holy Saturday. It's particularly in this moment that God himself is implicated in hope. If little girl Hope is the figure who predominates and weaves her way through Peggy's poem, it may come as a surprise this little girl seems to recede before, or is rather enfolded by, another figure at the poem's end, the majestic Lady Night. We discover that hope has been enfolded into the maternal care of this other figure in quote 6. God says, O night, my finest invention, my most noble creation of all, my most beautiful creature, creature of the greatest hope, you give the most substance to hope. You are the instrument, you are the very substance and the dwelling place of hope. It's you who gently rock the whole of creation in a restoring sleep. Night, like a mother, gathers all children, including the young hope, into the folds of her dress. And yet, not only the children of men and women, God's own child is also lulled to sleep by night. His son is enfolded by her into surrender. God addresses night with gratitude. You who used to lay the child Jesus every night in the arms of the most holy and immaculate one, you who are the turned sister of hope, O my daughter, first among all. This image of the child Jesus enfolded by night seems to prompt another important memory that evokes an even deeper wonder in God. As if being drawn from one recollection to another, God recalls a unique occasion on which he owes night a singular gratitude. But above all night, you remind me of that night, and I will remember it eternally, he says. This night is the evening of Good Friday, which in Jewish reckoning signals the beginning of the Sabbath and thus of Holy Saturday, the day of the burial of the Son. It is intriguing that Peggy chooses to end his poem here, on this dark moment of salvation history, in order to crown his reflection on hope. There are other and much more obvious scriptural roads he could have taken, such as images of the resurrection, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Thomas touching the wounds of Christ, Mary Magdalene hearing her name in the garden, or the women tentatively approaching the tomb on Easter Sunday. But Peggy chooses to end his poem here, just as the pregnant anguish moments of Good Friday and the shrouded silence of Holy Saturday begins, and as the figure of night draws her mantle over the body of the dead Christ. God laments that, unlike every other man on earth who has the right to bury his own son, he alone, God, has his hands tied by this adventure. And although he is a father at that moment, like so many fathers, he is uniquely helpless. He's unable to bury his son. Rather, God must surrender the burial of his son to another. Quote 7, "It was then, O night, that you arrived. O my daughter, my most precious among them all, and is still before my eyes, and it will remain before my eyes for all eternity. It was then, O night, that you came, and in the great shroud you buried the centurion and his Romans, the virgin and the holy women, and that mountain upon which the evening was descending, and he who died for them, and the men sent by Joseph of Arimathea, who were already approaching, bearing the white shroud." That's the very last line of the poem. God, unable to bury his own son, must surrender tonight as she unfolds the entire scene with the mantle of her maternal darkness. She hides even from God the image of the dead son and provides thus a kind of relief, and one is inclined to imagine a new locus of hope. For who hopes for what one sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Peggy has powerfully implicated God in the human experience of hope. It is an inversion of our expectations and the traditional articulation of the theological virtues, since, as you might know, Aquinas did not think that even Jesus had this theological virtue, since he already possessed the beatific vision in his life. Yet nevertheless, in the Son, the Good Shepherd, hope is made possible for God. That sheep, therefore, quote 8, who left and who almost became lost by his very going away, because he was going to miss the evening call, he aroused fear, and thus he caused hope itself to spring forth from the very heart of God, from Jesus' heart, the shudder of fear and the shiver, the tremor of hope. Thus, according to Peggy, and this is quote 9, God placed his hope, his poor hope, in each one of us, in the tiniest of sinners. Will it be said that we tiny ones, that we sinners, will it be we who do not place our hope in him? God entrusted us with his Son. Alas, alas, God entrusted us with our salvation to take care of our salvation. He made his Son and our salvation, and thus his hope itself depend on us. Nowhere in the poem do we see this entrustment, this hope, more than at the very end, when God must rely on Joseph of Arimathea and the other men bearing the white shroud. The beginning of Holy Saturday becomes the concluding image of hope in Peggy, both our hope and God's. It's a similar kind of inversion in our understanding of hope that Ratzinger proposes in his own meditation on Holy Saturday. In eschatology, Ratzinger turns to the liturgy, this time to the Litany of Saints, the long prayer of intercession that the Church prays on Holy Saturday at the Easter Vigil. He says that this litany absorbs into itself all those concerns with which time harries us, while counterposing to them the pledge of hope. Hope, for Ratzinger, is once again construed in terms of Peggy's hope in you for me, and the ongoing relationship between wayfarers and the saints. The wayfarer, the one who experiences the loneliness and dangers of time and eternity, finds a shelter in the communion of saints, indeed a mantle under which to take refuge, Ratzinger says. In other words, there's a kind of mystical friendship for the Christian with the other friends of Christ who have already passed through the doors of death. Ratzinger further develops this communal dimension of hope and friendship to include the role saints, the true friends of God, can play in accompanying Christ in his loneliness. Thus, in a sense, the motif of Christ accompanying us into the dark night of death as the ground of our hope is almost reversed. The saints, Ratzinger suggests, can accompany Christ into his night. His language here is bold, offering the examples of the great Carmelites John of the Cross and Therese of Lisieux, Ratzinger says that for these friends of God, quote 10, hell has taken on a completely new meaning and form. For the saints, hell is not so much a threat to be hurled at other people, but a challenge to oneself. It is a challenge to suffer in the dark night of faith, to experience communion with Christ in solidarity with his descent into the night. One draws near to the Lord's radiance by sharing his darkness. One serves the salvation of the world by leaving one's own salvation behind for the sake of others. That is, Ratzinger suggests, the saints are invited to accompany Christ in his descent into hell and his experience of Holy Saturday. Such a radical re-envisioning of the traditional doctrine of the burial of Christ and the descent into hell is strongly reminiscent of Peggy. Just as for Peggy, the traditional construal of us hoping in God is reversed, whereby God hopes in us and is himself subjected to that hope. So too in Ratzinger, hope is reversed whereby we, particularly in the saints, accompany Christ in his saving descent. As Ratzinger commented, Peggy's affirmation, "I hope in you for me," means it is when the I is at stake that the you is called upon in the form of hope. For Ratzinger, as for Peggy, the I and the you can be interchangeably both God and man. In conclusion, Ratzinger's language describing the saints' mystical experience of accompanying Christ in his death and descent is meant to deny nothing of hell's dreadful reality in the traditional sense. But like Peggy, Ratzinger's very next breath performs a kind of his subtle inversion. He insists in quote 11, hell is so real that it reaches right into the existence of the saints. Hope can take it on only if one shares in the suffering of hell's night by the side of the one who came to transform our night by his suffering. Thus, strangely, just as Christ came to befriend us and walk with us through our loneliness and death, we may, to some degree, also console and walk with him, and in so doing take part in his mission to rescue humanity. Hope, for Ratzinger, intoned in the same register as that of Peggy, furiously takes on the suffering of hell's night by journeying courageously with Christ in his mission to rescue us. Little girl Hope joins her hands with Therese, John of the Cross, Mother Teresa, and many other saints who have accompanied the Son into the mysterious Sabbath night of surrender, enfolding human suffering, death, and loss under the trembling, hopeful gaze of the Father. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maura, also for being on time, both of you, because this is just a sign of respect for the audience to allow them questions. And now we're going from South Bend to Kansas with Professor Ramage. We have been touching upon conscience, truth, eschatology, and hope, key aspects in the theology of Ratzinger, and now we had religious freedom. Professor Ramage, you can use this.
Okay. Thank you, Father. Yeah, the reception of Dignitatis Humanae, Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom in Ratzinger, at a time when the teaching of Vatican II and the magisterium of the past are often regarded as mutually incompatible, the need for a balanced voice witnessing to the faithful preservation of the Church's living tradition has never been more urgent. The challenge of forging a coherent vision that bridges past and future becomes especially acute in the case of religious liberty, where an apparent contradiction emerges. The very freedom of religion that the magisterium had condemned scarcely a century earlier was unambiguously proclaimed as a fundamental and universal human right by Vatican II. In the effort to illuminate the inner coherence of the Catholic tradition amid such change, I will be examining Ratzinger's reception of this doctrine of religious liberty through the lens of his hermeneutic of renewal and reform. Throughout his career, Ratzinger argued that the perceived need to choose between past and present magisterial teaching on this matter represents a false dichotomy. Rather than rupture, he saw the Declaration as a paradigmatic instance of living tradition at work, what newly minted doctor of the Church, John Henry Newman, called an authentic development of doctrine, a deepening of the Church's perennial heritage, and a privileged arena in which she has sought to engage modernity on a subject of the utmost urgency. So the historical context leading to Dignitatis Humanae. To appreciate the achievement of Dignitatis and Ratzinger's reception of it, it's necessary to understand something of the Church's position prior to Vatican II, a stance enshrined in a long history of doctrinal pronouncements and shaped by the geopolitical circumstances of the day. Earlier encyclicals, such as Gregory XVI's Mirari Vos, 1832, and Pius IX's Quanta Cura of 1864 strongly opposed the idea of religious pluralism, emphasizing that error has no rights. Indeed, the 1864 Syllabus of Errors explicitly condemned the notion that, quote, every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. Historically, this notion has at times led ecclesial authorities to sanction acts of violence under the banner of faith. Among figures of this persuasion stands no less a figure than Aquinas, who found it acceptable to subject heretics to obedience, quote, under bodily compulsion, and, if necessary, to deliver apostates to secular tribunals, quote, to be exterminated thereby from the world by death. A pivotal moment in history occurred in November of 1964. The American bishops took the lead, urging the church to issue a formal declaration on religious freedom. Otherwise, they said, we shall lose the trust of the Christian and non-Christian world. Gathering 1,000 signatures in a petition to the Holy Father, permission to craft this document was granted, and Dignitatis Humanae was born. It prefaces its teaching by explicitly stating that it, quote, leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one Church of Christ, and that believers, quote, have the duty of spreading the Catholic faith abroad among all men. In the document's own words, the Council intends to develop the doctrine of recent popes on the inviolable rights of the human person and the constitutional order of society. With these parameters in place, Dignitatis emphatically teaches that all humans, quote, are bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth and to adhere to the truth once it is known, and to order their whole lives in accord with the demands of truth. But the core message of the declaration I want to focus on here is a block quote, however, men cannot discharge these obligations in a manner in keeping with their own nature unless they enjoy immunity from external coercion as well as psychological freedom. Religion of its very nature consists before all else in those internal, voluntary, and free acts whereby man sets the course of his life directly toward God. No human power can either command or prohibit acts of this kind. Echoing the thought of Newman, among others, the document adds that the imperatives of divine law come to man through the mediation of conscience, and in this light, it contends that no one is to be coerced into faith. Even so, it recalls regrettable moments in church history where, quote, there appeared a way of acting that was hardly in accord with the spirit of the gospel or even opposed to it. Having expounded this vision, Dignitatis boldly delivers on its commitment to doctrinal development with this formal declaration. This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom, that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person. Despite overwhelming approval by the Council Fathers and a personal commendation from Paul VI, Dignitatis distinguished itself as the most contentious document of the Council. Most infamous among its critics was Archbishop Lefebvre, whose later schismatic acts of consecrating bishops without papal mandate was driven in part by his belief that the document represented a departure from Catholic doctrine and a capitulation to the modernist heresy of indifferentism. Meanwhile, Ratzinger and congenial thinkers have offered a compelling counterpoint to the narrative of rupture advanced by Lefebvre. From the outset, however, it should be observed that Ratzinger's reading already commends itself over Lefebvre's by virtue of its sober acknowledgement that the Church's prior political posture was profoundly deficient. In his council notebook published under the title Theological Highlights of Vatican II, Ratzinger reflected at length on Dignitatis as a necessary corrective to the Church's past missteps in her forays into politics, indicating that these had adverse implications not only for persecuted individuals, but also for the Church. quote, few things had hurt the church so much in the last 150 years as its tenacious clinging to outmoded political religious positions. The attempt to use the state as a protector of faith from the threat of modern science served more than anything else to undermine the faith and to prevent the needed spiritual regeneration. It supported the image of the church as an enemy of freedom, as a church which feared science and progress. Ratzinger goes on to explain that the church's missionary history has always been grounded in the conviction that faith must be freely embraced, since it so often involved appeals to potential converts to freely renounce their traditional, often state-sponsored religions. Given the church's place in the world as history's foremost advocate of freedom, he observes, quote, it's therefore all the more scandalous that so much prodding from the de-Christianized world was needed to make the church realize and recall what belongs to its very nature. The fact that Vatican II had to correct earlier positions and that figures like the FEV could appeal to prior teachings in support of their rejection of the council raises the question of how Dignitatis can be understood as continuous with prior magisterial teaching. The introduction, as I said, indicates that it leaves intact past teaching. However, apropos of this and other comparable assertions, Ratzinger observed that the text itself, quote, corrects and modifies these earlier statements, offering something new, something quite different from what is found in the statements of Pius XI and Pius XII. As an academic and pope, Benedict went so far as to state that the trilogy of Dignitatis Humanae, Gaudium Spes, and Nostra Aetate together function as a, quote, revision of the syllabus of Pius, a kind of counter-syllabus. As for Dignitatis, I've noted that it states that it intends to develop teaching on religious freedom. This phrase is critical because, like Dei Verbum says, there is a growth in the understanding of the realities and words handed down by the church. And then, of course, we have John the 23rd's programmatic line from the opening speech at the council that his greatest concern is that the sacred deposit of Christian doctrine should be guarded and taught more efficaciously, bearing in mind that the substance of the ancient faith is one thing, the way it's presented is another. At bottom, Ratzinger maintains that the bishop's efforts in Dignitatis were driven by the conviction that they could effect real and concrete good for humanity by retrieving the church's ancient treasury of wisdom, ressourcement, while making the updates, the aggiornamento necessary to meet the unique challenges of modern man. Well, I need to take a sip of coffee and my kidney hands might make me spill this, my kidney meds, but I'm gonna try anyway. While praising Dignitatis and other conciliar texts for their courage and poise in undertaking the faithful updating of the tradition, one critical point that Ratzinger nevertheless underscored was an issue that the Vatican did not address. The fact that not everything in the history of the church is unequivocally good. In Ratzinger's words, legitimate tradition can coexist alongside distorting traditions. This vital observation often goes unacknowledged, but to grasp it is to understand what precisely it was that would preoccupy Ratzinger over the next 50 years, elucidating criteria by which to faithfully receive, soberly evaluate, and fruitfully renew tradition within the church. To accomplish this, he provided concrete practical guidance for distinguishing what's essential and cannot change in the church from what is contingent and therefore is subject to change. Notably, the Ratzinger-helmed CDF took up this subject and offered a detailed explanation of how developments in Dignitatis can occur. Importantly, it acknowledges, quote, it could happen that some magisterial documents might not be free from all deficiencies. And then in his presentation of the document, Ratzinger says, quote, there are magisterial decisions which cannot be the final word on a given matter as such, but despite the permanent value of their principles, are chiefly a signal for pastoral prudence, a sort of provisional policy. Their kernel remains valid, but the particulars determined by circumstances can stand in need of correction. I just find that fascinating, being you have the head of the CDF, former Holy Office, stating this. And then during his tenure as Pope, Benedict would say things like, Vatican II had, quote, reviewed or even corrected certain historical decisions, and in this apparent discontinuity, it preserved and deepened her inmost nature and true identity. In this way, we see that Benedict's hermeneutic of continuity that people speak of is actually a little more nuanced than that. It's a hermeneutic of renewal and reform. And within that, which is also not a hermeneutic of discontinuity, he sees Vatican II not as a rejection of all that came before on the one hand, or pretending that nothing changed on the other, but as a genuine development of the living tradition where permanent principles can coexist alongside not so permanent practical forms that depend upon historical situations. So apropos of this, Benedict taught, quote, it is in precisely the combination of continuity and discontinuity at different levels that the nature of true reform consists. And of course, it's also important to remember that Trent even used the word reform, so it doesn't mean reformation in the sense of the Protestant church. Having examined now how Benedict's hermeneutical principles enable us to hold together the church's ancient and modern teachings on freedom, we can highlight some of the chief themes that emerge in his reception of Dignitatis. First, there's its deeper penetration into something specific in the church's treasury of wisdom, namely, the unity of truth and freedom. This is enshrined in the teaching that the religious act must be free to be authentic, while simultaneously affirming the obligation for all who enjoy this freedom to seek the truth and adhere to it. A principle later confirmed by the Ratzinger-led CDF, it maintains that authentic freedom does not exist without the truth. And as JP2 said, truth and freedom either go together in hand or they perish together in misery. Second, Ratzinger highlighted that Vatican II's definition is the fruit of particular circumstances, specifically that the church has appropriated what is good in modern democratic ideals. By appropriating these things, the church has assumed the same basic posture toward the world that the fathers of medievals had in plundering the Egyptians of Greek philosophy. So the Vatican II document says, recognizing and making its own, this is Benedict, recognizing and making its own an essential principle of the modern state with the decree on religious freedom, Vatican II has recovered the deepest patrimony of the church in harmony with the teaching of Jesus himself and with the martyrs of all time. Third, Benedict affirms that, quote, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, which wins over the mind with both gentleness and power. On this score, David L. Schindler observes, the Dignitatis organically arrived at the rediscovery of freedom as an inherent dimension of truth. While still affirming that the truth alone frees, she now affirms at the same time in a more explicit way that truth itself presupposes freedom. In short, Ratzinger and those who appreciate his perspective maintain that Dignitatis safeguards the absolute character of truth by clarifying the conditions under which it may be freely and authentically embraced. Fourth, Ratzinger's reception of Dignitatis arises organically from his broader theological vision. Describing freedom as, quote, a structural principle of reality, Benedict insisted that religious liberty enjoys a special status among other freedoms because it expresses what is unique about the human person. Underscoring that religious freedom grounds moral freedom more broadly, the pontiff stressed that, quote, it is not merely immunity from coercion, but even more fundamentally an ability to order one's choices in accordance with the truth. Benedict understands that the right to religious liberty is the necessary ground of genuine faith, and therefore cannot be a prerogative of Christians alone. Fifth, precisely because coerced belief is no faith at all, Ratzinger emphasized that a robust culture of dialogue with other religions and philosophies must be an integral part of the church's mission of evangelization. This merits its own paper, which I'm writing, but this dialogue not only promotes the propagation of faith, but Ratzinger also spoke of the reciprocal capacity of these traditions to cleanse and heal one another. Strikingly, he advanced the claim that the pluralistic world we inhabit actually offers real benefits. It provides a service of purification as it challenges us to purify and deepen our faith. This humble admission aligns with Benedict's fundamental recognition that the church has received the full revelation of truth, but we as individuals have not. Our job, as he used to say, was not so much to possess the truth, but to gradually let the truth possess us. What then is the church's mission with respect to true freedom and authentic human flourishing in today's world? Let's make sure I have the right time. I never started my timer. Hopefully I'm fine for my conclusion, Father. Ratzinger argues that the church's task in relation to the state is to foster the conditions that make man's free yes to God possible. As the CDF put it under the direction of Ratzinger, the proper function of the church in matters of politics is to instruct and illuminate the consciences of the faithful, particularly those involved in political life. The church cannot force her gospel upon civil society, but must operate by way of invitation, by virtue of the strength of its intrinsic truth. This, in brief, captures how Benedict conceives of the church's role in light of the public character of Christianity. And these mark the broad contours of his interpretation of Dignitatis, that I have a paper on that's 4 times as long as what I've got here. And then a whole other paper on Ratzinger's politics. It involves embracing and developing the proclamation of religious liberty as a cornerstone of human flourishing, a freedom intrinsically ordered to the pursuit of truth, grounded in human dignity, and recognized as the precondition for a genuine encounter with Jesus Christ. There can be no doubt that a defining part of Benedict XVI's legacy is his vigilant stewardship of Vatican II's authentic teaching on freedom of religion. By the grace of God, the fruitful reception of the principles and example he has left us, we're ensured that Dignitatis Humanae remains a vital guide for the church as we navigate the ongoing challenge of understanding and defending religious freedom in the 21st century. Thank you.
Amazing. I mean, sharp 60 minutes. So we have 15 minutes for you. So this was the scope, out of respect for you as an audience, to pose your questions. So I just would ask you to introduce briefly and to do American questions, not in an Italian way. In Italy, it's very difficult to keep a question within 1 minute. So I would say, please be short. There's a question over there.
Thank you so much. My question is for Maura about quotes 10 and 11, because I've never read Ratzinger's Eschatology. When he talks about the saints accompanying Christ in hell, is this something he's describing about during their life on earth as their sanctification, or is he talking about some kind of communication between hell and heaven while they enjoy the beatific vision?
Thank you, Leah. Great question. The answer is the former. So Ratzinger retrieves sort of a theology of Holy Saturday in several works, including Introduction to Christianity, but also in his Eschatology. He retrieves that theology sort of in an existential register. So he's identifying the saints going through, for instance, the dark night described by John of the Cross, or as experienced by probably both Therese of Lisieux and Mother Teresa, as a way in which the saints are accompanying Christ in his passion, even unto a sort of existential experience of hell. Thank you.
Over here. 1, 2.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm sort of trying to play with this idea, but both Maura and Matty had this kind of discussion about specifically Christian accounts or specifically Christian virtues and the sort of existential sort of import to what is happening. But as I was hearing your presentations, I kept thinking this sounds very sort of Odyssean in some ways. There's sort of these themes of return through darkness, both in anamnesis, which requires a kind of operatic coming to sort of recognize your own ignorance and lack of sort of sight, but then also when Odysseus goes down into Hades on his path going home, he also has to sort of face this blind prophet and kind of go into this zone. So is there also a kind of Hellenic thing going on, sort of this Ratzinger project that is at the same time sort of trying to remind us that Christianity has this Hellenic, Homeric content, and even though we're sort of just giving Christian anthropology or something, there is this very strong sort of Greek notion and Odyssean notion about where we are sort of in the middle of the world.
Okay, I'll take that one. Yeah, I mean, the short answer I think is yes. I don't think it's a secret that Ratzinger is very favorable toward Greek philosophy. He even goes so far in some of his works to say that it's like providentially ordained that Socrates' works are received by the church, or Plato's works are received by the church, the wisdom of Socrates. So the anamnesis thing is a very intentional nod toward Greek philosophy as a corrective in some way to kind of manualist Thomism and the way that deals with things. I would add that I think in his account of conscience, there is an account of conscience in the Greeks prior to Christianity, but it's different, slightly different. And I think what Ratzinger is trying to draw out in his account is what you talked about return, kind of like returning to one's origins, this kind of memory, this Odyssean sort of journey. But he always wants to emphasize the way that God comes to us to help us return to him. And that's something that wouldn't necessarily be in a purely Greek philosophical account of the human condition. So I think that's what's added here, even though the term anamnesis is used. That's why I wanted to use his Communio article on the Trinitarian notion of the person and how I think that draws out the specifically like Christological connection there with anamnesis. Anyway, you want to say anything?
Well, that was a great answer. I don't know what I can really add to that. I do think that there is something kind of paradigmatic, that goes earlier than Christianity, and this whole idea of the descent into the underworld. I'm inclined to think of what C.S. Lewis says about like myths that precede Christianity being sort of taken up and redeemed in a way by Christianity itself. But I'll let Maddie's answer stand as it is.
And then here.
My question is for Matthew. I recently read through Dignitatis Humanum with a group of propedeutic year seminarians, and there was a small number of them that I could tell were squirmy and they were a little uncomfortable with it. So when I dug a little deeper, you could tell they interpret it through the eyes of relativism, that they think, oh, church thinks all religions are the same. And then when we went on to our relationship with non-Christian religions, they're praising Islam in this because look at the things we have in common with them. Like there was an uncomfortableness, and I think it came out of this relativistic thing. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit, because we know Ratzinger was very much against relativism. Could you speak to this a little bit?
Yes, of course. I could speak for 45 hours because I teach a course on it. Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I mean, I have some of my Benedictine College students here. And yeah, you get this at Benedictine College too. I think all the young people, they see relativism here, and understandably because, well, I'm American, right? I'm from the heartland here too, and this unbridled freedom. And it's not connected with truth. So I think like so many things that I end up teaching that flows from Vatican II and Ratzinger, whether it's the church's relationship with science or whether it's religious freedom or other religions, that's the impression that can be given. And so I try to get very existential. Imagine you're in a Muslim country. Would you want to have religious freedom? So and then I think this emphasis Ratzinger has on how, well, the council itself has, that the religious act has to be free, and how we've died because of state-sponsored religion. I think people have a magical idea that Christian emperors are immune from original sin. So then you have, there's various kinds of, let's just say, a view that would want a state-sponsored Catholic monarch There are different ways politics can end up working itself out. But whatever the case would be, I appreciate Ratzinger's point that the church attracts by invitation. I think it applies well with his theology of beauty that leads with beauty. And then with the other religions, this dialogue. Dialogue is taken to be indifference, but dialogue is service of the truth. But the humility he has, I try to call out, especially young people. You actually have something to learn from the other person. In fact, you might find out the Muslim has more charity than you. You get into the fine weeds of whether that's a theological virtue in the Muslim or not. But the fact is, Vatican II says they have, many of them, deep prayer lives, and that should challenge us because we have the full resources in our tradition. So that's a topic I love, and I hope that helps a little with my view on it.
Jay here, and then we'll go to Father.
Hi, thank you all for your talks. My name is Jay. I'm an undergraduate from University of Wisconsin. My question is specifically for Professor Ramage, particularly your fourth and fifth points about how religious freedom is a necessary ground for genuine faith and a necessary ground for religious dialogue. Although I kind of forgot a lot of encyclicals, I do remember that there was kind of a controversy with Gaudium et Spes among some people. I think it was Gaudium et Spes 22. That I believe Ratzinger was he somewhat an author in that, or he's involved in?
Wojtyła, I believe, had a hand in that
so he was involved.
too.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's a clear through line relation in Ratzinger's work when he's talking about religious freedom and Gaudium et Spes, specifically the Gaudium et Spes 22.
And you're talking about man, the only creature made for his own sake, can only find himself through a sincere gift of self. That line, or is it a different line?
It might have been. It's more akin to the religious freedom line in respect for all religions.
I don't remember the exact line off the top of my head, but because it's a huge document.
Yeah.
But so is the question basically, so what's the thread there with the religious freedom with other religions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you then look not only at the council, but at Ratzinger's practice and the other popes as well, one illustration is the USCCB has a note that technically you don't pray with other religions, you pray in the presence of them. There's a fine line there. But we've seen popes go into mosques. They've celebrated Mass at Mary's house in Ephesus, which is a beautiful place, but my understanding is most people who go there are Muslims. So then there's a pontifical council document on interreligious dialogue, and it talks about how we're actually called to engage them theologically, like the standard formal dialogue, but dialogue of life, it calls it. Especially at UW, I remember good experiences there. You encounter everybody, right? Just being in class with a Muslim or a Jewish brother, but then also there's dialogue of action. It received the council saying, we don't want to just have a mere Christianity or a mere theism, but dialogue should help us refine ourselves, should help be a propedeutic for their evangelization, for the proclamation of the gospel. But also, if we want to change this world for the better, we need to be able to collaborate with them. And so I've tried to do this over the years, but I can't get people to collaborate in pro-life work with Catholics. And I don't know why, it's probably my own fault. But you would think, right, that belief in Islam and Judaism and Hinduism and beyond would cause that. So those are some thoughts I have on tying that together and how it's been received in the work we have laid out for us.
Father?
I'd like to thank all three speakers for your fine papers. I have questions for all of you, but I'm not going to ask them. I'm just going to ask one for Dr. Ramage. My question is this. Do you think there is an applicability of Ratzinger's formal way of criticizing, especially 19th century documents, the ones that you mentioned, for particular deficiencies that are tied to the particularities of their context, that we could apply today to Ratzinger's counter syllabus? And if so, what do you think are those things of that counter syllabus of Gaudium et Spes, Nostra Aetate, Dignitatis Humanae, that after some decades perhaps stand in need of some tweaking or correction in the same way he thought the syllabus in the 19th century did?
Yeah, that's a good one. And, first of all, this hermeneutical renewal and reform that acknowledges distorting elements of the tradition he corrected, he applies this to every topic, right? Biblical scholarship, past statements on faith and science, things like that. But yeah, in fact, even in the council notebook, he says Gaudium et Spes was overly naive and utopian at points. So it's funny that already in the 60s he was saying that. I think, some of the things in, the idea generally, his criticism, and this is, I think, of Sacrosanctum Concilium as well, is looking back on it through his writings. He said we were a little naive that we could make this development and it would just be received properly all along. But my short answer is, I would say it's for being overly naive. And then my own wording would be, it's like Chesterton's fence. Before you remove the fence, make sure you know what it's there for. And how, like with fasting rules, you get rid of the Friday meat requirement and all of a sudden nobody does anything on Fridays, even though I believe canon law says you have to. And so, yeah, sorry to, make your conscience aware of that. But Ratzinger says it's better to have your conscience aware of it, so you should evangelize. Anyway, those are a few thoughts I have.
I have a question here.
My question is for Maura. Maura, we often think of hope as like a work, but Peggy is really suggesting it's more of like a surrender, especially with his last passages about night, right? Can you speak a little bit about how precisely Peggy offers an antidote to kind of modern anxiety? I wish everyone that struggles with that could read the last few pages of his work, but can you speak to that relationship?
It's a great question. I wish more people read poetry. I wish more people would read Peggy's poem. I do think that maybe especially in modern American culture, while it's been around for a while, a sort of emphasis on striving, individual effort, work, is the source of at least some of our anxiety, the sense that it's all up to us to get to the end of the road. And I do think that Peggy's poem just imaginatively looks at hope as something very different. So even though he would agree with, for instance, with Thomas Aquinas, that hope is ordered towards like an arduous good, heaven, he would also agree, with Aquinas, that one can only hope because hope is a gift that needs to be received and surrendered to. And Peggy retrieves that for us through a series of really compelling images about hope. Maybe the primary one being that he characterizes hope as a little girl born just this past Christmas, I think he says. So that hope herself is holding the hands of faith and charity, who he characterizes as older women who would become old and decrepit without hope pulling them along on their way to heaven. So those are just some thoughts, but thank you for the question.
Well, this group is super disciplined. So no, we have time for one last question here.
Use the mic.
Okay. Thank you. This is for Dr. Vinnerstrom. John Paul II in Theology of the Body talks about the distant echo. How does longing for the distant echo, longing for original unity with God, play into Ratzinger's idea of conscience and longing for that as well?
I guess in short, it does play into that. I think Ratzinger has very great confidence in, the biblical law written on one's heart. And I actually think that that's related to some of what Dr. Ramaj is saying about religious freedom, that he doesn't think, in the same way that JP2 doesn't think, that there's really all that much to fear ultimately from engagement with other cultures or the world, because there is this design of truth and union with God in us. I don't think he's naive about that at the same time. I think he's obviously very concerned about like currents of relativism. He's concerned about political movements that have damaging views of God and the human person. Yeah, I have a lot more to say about that, but I could talk to you about it afterwards if we need to wrap up.
Thank you for your insightful questions. Please join me in thanking all the panelists here. And we can follow our conversations now with coffee and pastries.
Thanks, Father.